Well, let's take our Bibles, please, at this time. Turn to Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16. Speaking of music, I don't know about you, but I was not raised in a church like this. So when I got saved, I knew very few songs in the songbook, maybe a couple at best. I know hundreds of them now. But there was one song in particular that I took to immediately when I got saved, and it was written by Esther Kerr in 1930. And it's entitled, When We See Christ. I think we're familiar with that. It will be worth it all when we see Christ. And Esther Kerr was going through a very hard time when she wrote that. She actually lived on a number of years after that, died in 1962, so our lives actually overlapped by a couple of years. But she was going through some real hardships, and she was absolutely overwhelmed by them. Her husband, I believe, was a chaplain in the ministry, and some things had just gone south. And so with a heavy heart, she needed to remind herself of the truth, that it will be worth it all when we see Christ. She sat down at a piano. She did something that very few songs have, and that is both the one who wrote the lyrics and the one who wrote the melody combining, and she wrote the whole thing. And anyway, it's become a classic, and it's helped people who are going through hardships to remember it will be worth it all. That is the message that I'd like to talk to you about. As we're in Luke chapter 16, we're in a familiar passage beginning in verse number 19. The Bible says there was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. Now, obviously, this is a passage that could be disturbing and sobering for some, but for others, it could be very encouraging, and that's the side of the coin that we want to look at as we realize what happens when we die, when we go to heaven, and when we realize that everything as God's people we've gone through down here was worth it. Let's pray before we begin. Thank you, dear Lord, for this passage, and we thank you for some things that we can glean from it, and I pray for your help as we look at the man Lazarus and we see what became of him when he died and realize that's the glorious fate that awaits us as a child of God. We ask it now in Jesus' name, amen. Now, if you read commentaries about Luke chapter 16 and these verses here, you'll find that many of them mention this being a parable. I've never believed that it's a parable. Christ told a lot of parable, and it basically was a story, fictitious in nature, but something with a point. I don't think there's anything fictitious about Lazarus and the rich man. I find twice Christ saying there was a certain man, and he mentions the rich man. Then he says there was a beggar, and then he even gives him a name, something he never did in parables. He names one of the characters in this parable or this story, and so I don't believe it is a parable. I think it's something that actually happened. And if you remember, Christ being omniscient, knowing everything that's going on all the time, knew of this particular incident. When it happened, we don't know. It could have happened earlier that week. He was aware of it. It could have happened 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier, 50 years earlier, most likely in the Middle East because of the setting and so on. But we do know this, that we're all going to die. We do know that death is real. I've mentioned before, back in high school, I dug graves, and it was a sobering reminder to a 15-year-old kid that death is certain. Somebody has well said, death is genetic, and how true that is. It's in the genes, it's in the DNA. Death is genetic, it's built in, it's part of the package. And I quoted earlier today that familiar verse from Romans 5:12, wherefore is by one man, Adam, death entered into the world, and death, or sin entered in, and death by sin, and wherefore death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. And so we're all going to die. Now, I remember years ago hearing about a fellow who said, I'm not interested in knowing when I'm going to die. He said, but I do want to know where I'm going to die. And somebody said, why is that? He said, well, if I know where I'm going to die, I just won't go there, all right? And you say, that'll help me to avoid death. But folks, nothing can keep us from avoiding death. I read something here a while back. Scientists have discovered something about the compilation of food and energy in a particular process with breathing, and it's called oxygen radicals. And this particular thing contributes to the aging factor, the fact that we are all slowly dying. Something about every breath we take with the food energy and the oxygen radicals contributing to death. And somebody says, well, I just won't breathe. But obviously that doesn't work. That's a no-win situation. And the point is, we are slowly dying. And death is going to run its toll. It is genetic. And Hebrews 9:27 says, it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. That's an appointment we all have. People try and push it out of their mind. They don't think about it, but the wise person will prepare for it. And even a saved person should really contemplate and consider it from time to time. We only have so many days here to serve the Lord. And I know what happens to the lost man at death. It's laid out here in Luke 16. I know what happens to the man who disobeys the gospel, never accepts Christ as his Lord and Savior. The answer is obvious. We find in verse 23 of the rich man, it says, and in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments. And that is the fate that awaits the lost person. I'm not smart enough to explain that away. Honestly, there are some who say, well, it doesn't mean this, it means that, and so on and so forth. No, I think it means what it says. God has opened the curtain here for us on death. He's pulled it back. He's enabled us to peer in and realize, okay, this is what happens. And what we read here in Luke chapter 16 really removes the question mark about death and the afterlife. We see right here the other side of death's door. And Christ purposely lets us see it. And so it's not a matter of, well, I wonder what happens when my heart stops. You don't have to wonder. There are a lot of people who say, well, I don't know. And brilliant, wise philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, they had all kinds of wisdom on all kinds of things, but none of them had the answer to what happens on the other side when the heart stops. They did not know, but we can read it right here in the Bible. For the lost person, this is how it's going to play out. For the saved person, this is how it's going to play out. We find it right here. There's no need for confusion. If you have been born again, you're going to heaven when you die. If you have never been born again, Jesus himself said in John 3, except a man or woman be born again, they cannot see the kingdom of heaven. So without this being born again, whatever it is, it's so important. Without it, you're going to miss heaven. We talked about what it is this morning. The fact is, we're born into this world spiritually dead, not in God's image as we were originally created. And back to that verse, by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. Death was passed upon all men. It was passed upon us. And that's why we're sinners. That's why you don't have to teach a toddler how to lie, how to sass back, how to be selfish with his toys and steal cookies and whatever else it might be. Nobody has to teach a toddler how to sin. We're born with a sin nature. We're born spiritually dead. And somebody says, well, what do I have to do to wind up in hell? Nothing. Just keep going on the way you are. That's the way we're born into this world. Somebody says, well, you have to commit some big sin, murder, rape, whatever it is along the way, and then when you die, you're not going to make... No. We're born into the world lost, and someplace between birth and death, we have to have a new birth, spiritually speaking. For me, it was 45 years ago. For you, you remember that day. And I know it's special, and it always will be. It doesn't come by getting baptized. It doesn't come by doing good works. It doesn't come by joining a particular church, being part of a certain denomination. I've said many times, you could be baptized in that baptistry. You could be a member of Fargo Baptist Church and still die lost and miss heaven. It's in the blood of Christ. It's in the atoning sacrifice he made for us. Our faith being in that, plus nothing, minus nothing, turning from our sin and repentance and placing all of our faith in what he did on Calvary's cross for us. Calling upon the Lord, asking him to save us, and by faith, believing his promises, for whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Have you done that, friend? Have you had a time in your life when you were genuinely born again the Bible way? Now, if you have been, I have something glorious to share with you. Paul said to be absent from the body is to be what? Present with the Lord. To be absent, you're not in limbo someplace, you're not in purgatory someplace, you're not soul sleeping someplace, you're not just unconscious along with a body in the ground. To be absent from that body is to be present with the Lord. And so for a born-again Christian, the door of death can be a welcome sight. It can be a welcome sight. It can be something you look forward to. Lazarus went through that door and realized it was worth it all. And what Esther Kerr wrote is true, it's worth it all. Now, when Lazarus died, there were several things, maybe 3 or 4, that he discovered upon death. And the first one is what I call a glorious reception. Notice in verse 22, it says, "And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom." There it is. Lazarus died, and if this was before the resurrection of Christ, which it was, he was carried by the angels' bosom, by the angels into Abraham's bosom. We would call that paradise. I wish I had time to go into that Bible study. It actually ties into what I was talking about last week with Christ placing that blood on that mercy seat. We believe that paradise, or Abraham's bosom, was in the vicinity of hell because they could see across from each other. Here in Luke 16, we believe the place hell being in the bowels of the earth. Paradise at that time was down there, but there was a great gulf fixed between them. Paradise was not a place of suffering. It was a place, well, it was heaven at the time, if you will. And we read later on in Ephesians that after the resurrection, Jesus Christ led captivity captive. You ever read that? And he actually led those people out of that place and into heaven as we know it today. And it's a long Bible study. If you've ever read accounts where, like, King Saul called up Samuel, remember that? And the Bible speaks of Samuel being down there, and you go, wait a minute, heaven's supposed to be up there. It was a different era, and I talked about this morning. And so anyhow, you find out it came to pass that Lazarus dies, and he's carried by angels to Abraham's bosom. Now, the death of Lazarus, it was pending, and it was coming, and really, that's the same for all of us, because it's a matter of time for all of us. Every single sunrise puts us one day closer to that day when our eyes will close in death. The clock is continually winding down from the moment that we come into this world and we take our first breath that I talked about earlier today. I was holding a little baby girl here a few weeks ago, and she had just been born like a couple days before. Oh, fresh from the Creator's hand. You talk about precious. And I was thinking to myself, she will never be this young. Every day she wakes up now, she will be moving one day closer to that day. We all have that appointment. We all have that appointment. You know, growing up, my mom and dad were very different in one area. Mom was always early for everything. Always early for everything. Dad was always late for everything. Me, I'm always right on the minute because I just don't have time to come early. My daughter, years ago, had set something up with a friend of hers and for me to pick them up. And it was like 5 minutes to that time, and the friend said, your dad's, he's going to be late. And my daughter said, no, he'll be here right on time. And another minute or two went by. Oh, he's not going to be here. She said he'll pull up right at the same time. And finally, within that 60 seconds, I pull up, and she goes, there he is. He just always is. Now, I try to stay at least on time. You know, I've heard the expression before of people who are late all the time. They're going to be late for their own funeral. You ever heard that? My mother used to say that about, you know who. He'll be late for his own funeral. But let me just say this. No, you won't. That's a date with destiny that you have, and it's an appointment you're going to have to keep. You're going to have to keep. Now, in verse 22, it says, and it came to pass that the beggar died. And that day is coming. It's going to come to pass for all of us. Whatever the situation might be that we are going through now, it's going to come to pass. I heard of an old-timey preacher who said that's his favorite verse in the Bible. It came to pass. And he said, I'm glad it doesn't come to stay. I'm glad it comes to pass. Or we use the expression, this too shall pass. But we find here when it comes to life, things come and go, and it comes to pass. And Paul even mentions our light afflictions are but for a moment. Isn't that a glorious truth? Maybe somebody sitting here, you're going through some afflictions right now. It's just for a moment. It will come to pass. And for Lazarus, he had an appointment to keep. It was with death, and we'll all have this appointment to keep. I don't know when it will be, but I'll guarantee you it will be within God's will always for everybody. I was talking to my wife yesterday about somebody we knew had cancer years ago and was supposed to die. And he went in, he did the treatment, did that whole thing, and he came out the other side, lost a ton of weight, really took a beating physically. But you know, it's been a few decades and he's still alive. And I thought to myself, it was not his time. I'm thinking of a Bible college student I went to Bible college with years ago. And he was a few years ahead of me. He graduated. He went out to the East Coast. He became an assistant pastor out there. And somehow he knew he was going to die soon. He knew it. He prepared his will. He prepared his wife. He prepared his kids. He prepared his pastor. He said, I don't know why I know this, but he said, I know I'm going to die soon. He was driving a week or two later and had somebody in his car with him and hit a drunk driver head on. His neck snapped instantly. He was out in eternity. The guy next to him walked out of the accident without a scratch on him, and it was just his time. God was telling him it was his time, and he even prepared the funeral message beforehand, knowing his lost loved ones would be there. And my point is this: God has an appointed time for all of us. We just don't know when, and we don't know where. We need to be ready for it. And may I say to young people here, youth is God's best time for the heart. If you're here and you're saying, well, I'm just putting it off, or even an adult saying, I'll deal with that later, I'll deal with that down the road, and so on. You know, as you wait, your heart gets harder. This is not a good idea. Youth is God's best time for the heart. Plus, you never know when that time comes. You know, I read years ago about a guy who was out mowing his lawn, and his neighbor was next door barbecuing out there, and as the guy's going by with his mower, all of a sudden the neighbor next door drops to the ground. And what had happened is the mower had caught a foreign object in the grass there, and it hit the guy with it. It killed him instantly. Can you imagine being out there flipping hamburgers and all of a sudden you're out in eternity? None of us know when that day is going to be. And so we have no say when it comes to when we're going to die and how we're going to die, but we do have some say in where we're going to spend eternity. That's a choice that God's given to us. That's an opportunity we have, and every person ever born has had that opportunity to say yes to Christ or to say no to Christ. You know, Cain said no to Christ. Abel said yes to Christ. Noah said yes to Christ. Nimrod said no. You could go through the Bible and find guys like Moses. He said yes to Christ. Pharaoh, he said no. David said yes. Goliath said no. Elijah said yes. Jezebel said no. We can go right on down the line. Peter said yes. Judas said no. And the rich man said no. Lazarus said yes. We all have that decision to make. And you say, well, I'm not going to make a decision. Not to decide is to decide not. You have to decide. You have to make a decision. That's the bottom line. Now, for Lazarus, he accepted Christ, obviously, as his Lord and Savior. He didn't go to heaven here because he was poor, because he had a rough life. There's bad theology out there they'll say, well, the rich man had it made here. That's why he went to hell, and Lazarus went to heaven because he had a rough go. No, that's not it at all. We know this, that Lazarus had been born again. And so when he dies, he has a glorious reception. Verse 22 says, it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. We know this, that when he died, he woke up on the other side with angels around him, carrying him to heaven, as it were, at that time. You know, I thought before, and I didn't know the Bible very well as a young convert, but I did wonder, when I die, okay, I'm saved now, but how am I going to know my way to heaven if I get in a car accident? You know, when I was in the first grade, I got lost on the very first day of school. Now, in kindergarten, I just have to walk across the alley, and I, caught the bus and, that kind of thing. But in the first grade, I was over a mile away from home. And I remember my mom saying, now just wait around here, and your brother will meet you in this particular place, and he knows the way home. And so I showed up at that place, but my brother didn't. It was late, and it's scary when you're like this tall, and you're going, where in the world am I? I was lost. When you die, you don't have to know the way to heaven. You'll be escorted by angels according to what we read right here. Now, I don't know how many angels. I know it's more than one because I find an S at the end of angel. And whether it was two and you got one under each underarm carrying you there, or four, holding you by the hands and the feet flying through. I don't know. I just know we're escorted by angels into heaven at that time. And we find that's what happens when Lazarus died. Now, here's the ironic part. On earth, Lazarus was an absolute nobody. He was a zero with the ring rubbed out. We find out he was never in a fancy office in a white collar. He never was preeminent. He never did the lecture circuit. He never made high society news. Lazarus was never on the sports page or the mayor of a town. He was an absolute unknown. He was an absolute nobody. He was a beggar. He had some kind of infirmity. We don't know what that was. We do know the dogs would come and would lick his sores and so on. But he was once a down and outer, absolute nobody. And now he dies. He's escorted by angels. He arrives on heaven's shore. I don't know if they do ticker tape parades in heaven and red carpet and crowd noises and angels and limo rides and all that stuff. We don't obviously see that in the Bible. But we do know this, that when he arrived there, it was a glorious reception. My Bible says in Psalm 116:15, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. The death of Lazarus was precious in the sight of the Lord. And that verse tells me that when a believer dies, be they rich, poor, famous, infamous, when a believer dies, God takes notice. And here's old Lazarus. He's up in heaven now, and he's hearing things he's never seen before. He's seeing things he's never seen before. It's absolutely amazing. The dogs are gone. The pain is gone. The joy is overflowing, and it's all just begun. It's been going on like that for the last 2,000 years, at least. And so don't feel sorry for Lazarus here. Lazarus chose the Word over the world. Lazarus chose Christ over the cosmos. Lazarus chose salvation over sin, life over death. Lazarus made the right choice, and now he is in first-class accommodations. I don't know if you've ever flown first class before. I was online getting a plane ticket here in the last few days, and I saw there you can upgrade for $76 to first class. I thought, that's tempting, but I'm still way too cheap. And so I said, no, I'll go economy. But Lazarus was in first class now in heaven. And notice again back in verse 22, and it came to pass, Jesus says, that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. That is the fate of a born-again Christian. There's a glorious reception. And don't you for a skinny second let the devil try to convince you that as a believer you're wasting your time living for the Lord. The devil will come along, he'll sit on the shoulder, he'll say, what are you doing? No, reward day is coming. That glorious day is coming. There's an expression I find myself using in conversation with folks a lot. It's the expression delayed gratification. I think we can understand what that means. Delayed gratification means putting off the easy thing and doing the hard thing for now and delaying that gratification. This enters into our finances, our health, or whatever it might be. Doing the hard thing when we need to. And the devil will try and sell you a bill of goods and a lie that the Christian life is a dead end. It's a hard life. And he'll try and destroy your foresight. He'll try to discourage you. That the Christian life is too much to ask. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. There's a price to pay to live for Christ. There really is. And I'm not going to lie to you and say there's no pleasure out in the world, because even the Bible speaks of the pleasures of sin, right? But it adds for a season. For a season. It will come to an end, I'll guarantee you that. You will pay a price living for Christ, but I am saying it will be worth it all when we see Christ. And the price to be paid really is a small, small charge. You will be glad that you live for Christ one day. I promise you that. I promise you that. We have a song on Heaven 88.7 radio. We'll be glad we live for Him. And we'll be glad for Him. When you've walked your when we walk on streets of gold, we'll never grow old. Then we'll be glad we live for Jesus. When we traveled our last mile and He says, come in, my child, then we'll be glad we live for Him. Folks, that day is coming. You will be glad. And if you're saved, one day All of you that can die will die. Did you know that? All of you that can die will die. But the important part will be rejoicing in heaven with the Lord. My father-in-law passed away. It's going to be an anniversary next month. I think it'll be 32 years if I remember right. He was out west. He was fishing in the Pacific Ocean. He had a great day. We have a picture of his last day holding up a fish and smiling, and only 59 years of age. That night he had a massive heart attack. He was out in eternity, and we were trying to figure out how to fly the body back home. And we had the funeral over at our old building over there, and it was really a sad event and so on. And I'll never forget the funeral ending and them whisking the coffin into the hearse, and off it went out into the northwest corner of the state to be buried out there. And that was as far as we could go with him. But folks, when we die as believers, that's not as far as God can go with us. There's a difference. Did you know that at death a believer is given what I would call a soulish body? Have you ever wondered about that? Your real body goes back to the ground, and you say, well, you're going to be like ghosts and spooks just kind of floating around invisibly and so on. No, I don't find that. And I don't have time to show you a lot of verses on this, but I do know that when Christ went up to the top of Mount Tabor, wherever it was, at the Mount of Transfiguration, I've been there a few times, he is visited by Moses and Elijah. Now, we know this about Elijah. He went to heaven bodily, and that happened maybe 60 miles south of there in that valley by Jericho. I've been to that spot as well. But old Moses, he died and they buried him on top of Mount Nebo. Been to that spot as well. I don't know if I was within a stone's throw of the body of Moses, but I've been up there, at least the bones or the dust of Moses. But here's Moses. He dies down in the southern part of Palestine, and we find him 1,500 years later appearing with the Lord Jesus Christ, and Peter, James, and John able to see him. They gathered from the conversation, oh, that's Moses. And so here's Moses. He's visible to these men, these disciples, and he has some kind of a soulish body. And there's more in the Bible about that, but until we are reunited with our glorified bodies, God's going to give to us some kind of a soulish body. But my point is this: the graveside is not as far as God goes with us. He goes on all the way into eternity. So when Lazarus dies, he is escorted by angels. He's escorted by angels. I have often wondered if these were what we read about in Hebrews. Guardian angels are kind of hinted at there. I grew up hearing about guardian angels. I don't know about you. I didn't know any Bible, but I'd heard, whoa, we got guardian angels. I kind of try and turn real quick and catch them back there. And they moved on me. I'd go look in the mirror. I don't see them. But the Bible, actually, I find out after salvation there is such a thing. And whether we have one or two, and that's their final assignment, to be escorted by angels into heaven. And I'm glad to know we have those angels helping us, don't you? And we talked a lot about those things this last week here. I remember Larry Clayton talking about all the close calls he had been through in the ministry. I mean, he's seen it all, down to human sacrifices and jungles and you name it. He's been there in danger, and he said this to me. He said, when I get to heaven, I'm going to buy my guardian angel lunch for all the protection he gave me. And we both chuckled about that. I owe that guy lunch. All of this we know by faith, folks. By faith in what Christ has told us here. And the fact that it will be worth it all means there's going to be a glorious reception. On earth, this rich man had all the glorious, fancy things and the upper crust and the upper echelon and so on. But I will take God's recognition and God's approval and God's well done. I'd trade the whole world to hear those two words one day, wouldn't you? Well done. Well done. That's all we need. Christ said, what shall it profit a man if we gain the whole world and lose his own soul? And he's telling us in that statement that your soul is priceless. It's worth more than the whole world. All the oil, all the gold, all the diamonds, all the money on Wall Street. What does it profit a man or woman if they gain all of that, the whole world, but they lose their own soul in the process? God takes the biggest thing that we can relate to, the whole world, and he makes this comparison for us. And yet, sadly, There are many, many, many people, by the millions in fact, that sell out for much less. They sell out for much less. I'm not going to get saved, they say, because I'm afraid what my friends might think. Or I can't give up my lifestyle. You know, I've dealt with people that they're living in sin. They know it, but they say, I'm not going to give that up. Or I'm going to get persecuted if I become a real Christian. I don't want to pay that price. And so there they are with their worth in the world, and they just don't see what a foolish trade that is. Ask Lazarus, was it worth it? Was it worth it? We find here, first of all, this glorious reception that he discovered when he died. But secondly, he found this glorious release. In verse 20, Jesus says, and there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate full of sores and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. Here's Lazarus going through the mill. Now, Lazarus was godly. There's no question about that from what we read about it here. You say, well, Pastor, why do godly people suffer? That's a good question. It's a good question. I was talking to somebody earlier today, and they said, Pastor, I'm scared. I had a checkup, and there's a lump there where it ought not be, and I get the results this coming week. And you say, why do saintly people suffer? And they get bad news, and they go through things. Why did Lazarus go through hunger and pain and loneliness and all of this? Well, let me just give you several quick reasons why even we as believers down here have some rough going. Sometimes it might be sins committed against the body before we got saved, maybe too much alcohol. It'll affect the brain, it'll affect the liver. It might be too much drugs. I know of a missionary who had to deal with the consequences of his drugs before he got saved. Maybe it was promiscuity, and there's something that leaves that scar because of sins committed before we got saved. Sometimes we suffer because of bad moves even after we got saved. Maybe sowed some bad seed, maybe made a poor financial call, a poor judgment call, and now the crop comes in and we've got to reap what we've sowed. And I heard an old-timey preacher years ago say, just plow through that reaping, and if you'll come out on the other side, you'll be okay. But be willing to go through it now. Sometimes a Christian even will go through a rough time because of sins of others. Might be parents, it might be peers, it might be somebody that burns you, it might be somebody that cripples you, a drunk driver. And you know, there's so many examples of this. I read years ago about a dear young lady who had scaly skin all her life because her mother was a prostitute, and the syphilis was passed on to the daughter, and it was something she had to live with for the rest of her life. And that's just a tragedy. Now, for Lazarus, we don't know what it was. We don't know why he's suffering here. We do know this: suffering is a fact of life. In Job 14:1, it says, man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. That's a reality. Man that is born of woman means all of us is a few days, really, in light of eternity, and full of trouble. That's what sin has done to our world. Fifthly, though, I might add, suffering can be used of God to help us to learn some lessons. Suffering can be used of God to help us learn some lessons as believers, and it's something that only a Christian can understand. And how we respond to that suffering really dictates how long we might have to go through it. Sometimes we need a heavenly 2x4, don't we? Kind of get us back on track. But saintly people do suffer. And Lazarus knew suffering. We find in verse 21, he was desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. He knew hunger. We read on and it says, moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. He knew pain. We read on and we find that made for him an isolated life. He dealt with loneliness, no doubt. His only friend, a dog, if you can imagine that. And finally, that glorious release comes from all of that. It's a release from hunger. It's a release from pain. It's a release from the humiliation that he had to go through and the loneliness daily and so on. Because in heaven, it's all the opposite. There's no loneliness in heaven. There's no pain in heaven. There's no hunger in heaven. And so you come along now and you say, well, Lazarus, was this worth it all? Was this worth it all? And if you could go back and trade places with the rich man, would you? Of course not. Of course not. Never. You know, somebody put it this way, it'll cost you to be a Christian, but it'll cost you a whole lot more not to be a Christian. My pastor used to say that. It'll cost you to be a Christian, but it'll cost you a whole lot more not to be a Christian. Why cannot people see the reality of that? As they look at this world, they just dive into it, and it has no substance. It's like cotton candy. It's all fluff. There's just nothing there. It's not really what it's puffed up to be. It's a mirage. I've said that many times. So at this time, we find the rich man. He has the world by the tail. And you can picture him coming home at night, driving up to his garage door, hitting the remote and bringing his Lamborghini chariot into the garage and going inside. And there's a butler putting slippers on his feet and a maid putting a cocktail in his hand, and him sitting down and looking at his security cameras, and he sees Lazarus out there. Oh man, there's that loser again. There's that bum out there, that poor, demented, born-again Christian. I don't see it. I don't get it. What does he see in his Christianity? Besides all that, where's his God? Can you just hear him thinking? Can you see the wheels turning there? And can you also see how short-sighted he was? That's the problem with the world. That's the problem with the lost. Not once on earth did this rich man ever envy Lazarus. Not once. Not once did he want to trade places with him. Oh, but now the tables are turned, and he would give anything for one drop of water. One drop of water. Verse 24, it says, and he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. The tables totally turned after death. And folks, that's how it works. If we could only see the other side. On the other side, nobody's become somebodies. And on the other side, somebody's become nobodies. You know how many people are billionaires in the world right now? And envied by the masses, but I'm telling you, they won't be billionaires in hell. There's no billionaires in hell. There's no big shots in hell. It's totally a different place. And so we find that it was worth it all. And when Lazarus died, he discovered, first of all, a glorious reception, a glorious release, and finally and quickly, a glorious reward. In verse 25, Jesus speaking, the narration, he said, But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime receivest thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things, but now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. You know, in Psalm 73, the psalmist is lamenting all the stuff he's going through and all the good stuff happening to the wicked. And he makes a statement, why do the wicked prosper? That's a good question, isn't it? Why do the wicked prosper? If you've ever looked around, the mafia, they're pretty rich. They got a lot of money. They got everything. And there's a lot of rich atheists, and it's going easy for them. And you know, you got many ungodly, blasphemous celebrities and movie stars and politicians, and they're spewing out some of this anti-God stuff. And you say, you know, why doesn't a lightning bolt hit them? God doesn't operate that way. They might be prospering along the way. And you say, well, why? Let me just say this. Let them enjoy it now. That's all I can do. Let them enjoy it now. This is all they have. This world is all they have. Let them enjoy it now. This is the only heaven the lost will ever understand. All right? Years ago, we used to have a preacher in Dr. Mike Hayes. Somebody remember Brother Hayes? What a guy. What a character. He really was. He was the one who actually started the Hope Ministry, and it got passed on from there. And he discipled now Brother Carter, who oversees that. But he used to make this statement. He would talk about, you know, the folks who are trying to save the planet and green this, green that, eco this. And he said, you know, if you understand their thinking, and he'd counsel many of them, he said, this planet's all they have. And this is true. This is all they have. You know, there are folks by the hundreds right now having their bodies froze at death. Hey, if you can imagine that. It's called cryonics, I think. And they freeze the body at death down to 300 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. That's cold. And it's with liquid nitrogen, and this sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. You can Google this. It's going on. They're paying big money to this, having themselves froze in hopes that down the road a cure will be found, they could be revived. And you say, well, why? This world is all they have. They want to keep it going. It's a totally different philosophy than we have. Now, we find here there's something that you don't lose after death, in the next life. And in verse 25, Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime received thy good things. You know what you don't lose in the next life? The memory. Not for the lost person anyway. He is told here to remember what is, and by the way, you read on, he remembers he's got 5 brothers back there on the top side of the earth. They followed his example. He's burdened about them going to the same place, and he remembered all of that. The memory follows you. Somebody has suggested that's the worm that dieth not, and that's another whole sermon. But there is that memory. You don't lose it after death. The lost person on the other side, out in a Christless eternity, will remember every sermon they heard, every tract they read, every invitation they turned down, every opportunity they had to say yes to Christ. They will remember all that. You know, for the unsaved, you want to suggest they get all of they can out of this world, because this is it. And so here's the rich man. He's looking across this gulf and the flames and all of that. And I don't think at that moment he was thinking, you know, it still costs too much to be a Christian. If you're here today, if you're born again, if you're having it rough, let me encourage you by saying, you know what? It doesn't cost too much to be a Christian in light of what's waiting on the other side. What's waiting on the other side. I want to close with a verse here, and you don't have to turn there. We've had an intense week here. I get it. It really, it's been a heavy week, and I just wanted to give you something more foundational, maybe light, maybe basic, whatever, that for a born-again Christian, it will be worth it all. And I close with this verse. 1 Corinthians 15:58 says, Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain with the Lord. What did Lazarus realize when he died? Well, he realized it will be worth it all when we see Christ. There will be a glorious reception. There will be a glorious release from our problems. And there will be a glorious reward. Let's stand to our feet, please, at this time. I'd like to ask that our heads are bowed and eyes closed as we stand quietly before the Lord. Will it be worth it all? I think Esther Kerr nailed it. In the midst of problems, in the midst of pain, in the midst of hardship that was perhaps overwhelming for her at the time, she sat down at the piano and she wrote a classic, a timeless truth. It will be worth it all when we see